Okay, great. I think it's time to start the webinar now. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on from where you're joining us today. My name is Abel Ndasho, and I'm the program coordinator for the ANH Academy. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on Equitable Partnership, titled Power and Priorities, Equitable Partnership in Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Research, co-hosted in collaboration with UKRI. In case you didn't know, the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy is a global network of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers from over 100 countries working at the intersection of agriculture, food systems, nutrition, and health. It aims to facilitate rapid learning and sharing in this fast-moving field. If you're not a member yet, we encourage you to sign up and join the Academy after this webinar, and it's totally free to be a member. As well as convening technical working groups, hosting webinars like this one and blogs, we also have an annual member meeting of the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health community. The 5th ANH Academy Week, which normally rotates between Africa and Asia, is taking place at the end of this month. And obviously, this year it will be held virtually and of course for free. You can find the dates on your screen. We will also share more information in the follow-up email. We hope to see all of you during the Academy Week, albeit again virtually. Thalia will tell you more about today's webinar, but before we get started, I would like to go over a few technical items so we all know how to participate in this webinar. First, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourself using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's panelists by typing your question into the Q&A box in the Zoom panel. So if you have any question for the panelists, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. For anything else, you can use the chat one. You may send in your question at any time during the webinar. We will collect them and we will do our best to address most of them, if not all of them, during the Q&A time. If you want to ask a question using the audio function, please use raise your hand function during the Q&A time and we will unmute you. If at any point you experience any technical issues, please check your audio setting and your internet connection. If lost, please try to connect to the webinar using the same link. I think that's it for me for now. Over to you, Thalia.
Great. Can everybody hear me? Abel, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Wonderful. So first, I will reiterate a warm welcome to this webinar on Equitable Research Partnerships, which is co-hosted with UKRI within the Global Challenges Research Fund. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're very aware that there's a lot of webinar and Zoom overload going on at the moment, and there's a particular fatigue of online social interaction. But we hope that today's is both an interesting topic and an equitable platform, both for the speakers and the global audience that we have with us. I'd like to say a special thanks to Nicola Lowe, who's joining us today, and UKRI for co-hosting this event and suggesting it as a topic at the ANH Academy this year. As everyone knows, we're going virtual, and we've had to spread out some of the events across the weeks to maintain access for our global audience. So this event is designed to precede and accompany the ANH Academy Week. And I'll just reiterate that we'll kick off with our Learning Labs on Tuesday the 23rd, which is just over a week away. By introducing the Amana Program to those of you who don't know it already, I can also explain the impetus from our side for this webinar. So the Amana Program has 4 arms: the ANH Academy, which is an international network of researchers connecting agriculture, nutrition, and health. It offers fellowships to advance metrics and methods in this space, a synthesis center, and small grants. So when we were preparing for the next round of grants that we give out, we revisited the grant application assessment rubrics, and the question of equitable partnerships arose. And we thought about how we should judge this by the numbers of researchers in various places, by nationality, by institution, by budget share. And we thought about what would be the most meaningful metrics, especially in an application phase where it's a bit hard to judge. So this started an ongoing conversation among us and our collaborators, and this webinar is part of that. So today we welcome a wonderful panel of people with diverse perspectives. Nicola Lowe is a professor at the University of Lancashire and the GCRF Challenge Leader for Food Systems within the UK Research and Innovation. She has worked for over 15 years with a consortium in Pakistan, working on food and nutrition, especially zinc and iron. Valarie Bluebird-Jernigan is a professor in rural health and the director of the Center for Indigenous Health Research and Policy at Oklahoma State University Center for Health Sciences. Her work was featured in the co-production of Evidence series in Nature and on an amazing PBS special called Blood Sugar Rising about food environments and nutrition work in the Choctaw Nation. Bhavani RV is the Director of Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Program for the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. She was the project manager of the multi-country Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia, or LANSA, working alongside the late Dr. Prakash Shetty. So you'll notice that we have an all-female panel today. This wasn't by design. But for hundreds of years, there were all male panels and no one batted an eyelash. So we simply invited the people that we thought provided diverse perspectives here today, and they all happen to be women. We certainly aren't excluding men. Also, although it would have boosted our registration probably by two times, we decided not to call it Equitable Partnerships in the Time of COVID. Although there are certainly aspects of research, including access, remote data collection, reliance on local partners, trust, that will be important to think about in this webinar and in the coming months and years. So lastly, we hope that this important conversation, which is designed to cover really in broad strokes various aspects of equity and research partnerships, will be the start of further and deeper conversations about the nuances, practices, and imperatives in this space. So we look forward to that ongoing conversation. I'd now like to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves. So if you can just mention your disciplinary background, a short description of your work, past and present, or whatever is most relevant for our conversation today, and maybe describe when someone says equitable research partnerships, what you most readily think about. I think we'll start with Nicola and then go to Bhavani and end with Valarie, and I can also prompt you. And one last thing I'll mention is that we're not going to do slides today. We debated the normal format of each having a presentation and thought that maybe a conversation style would be more effective to talk about these important ideas and considerations in this space. So I hope you'll bear with us and take part in the conversation after our panelists have a chance to speak. So I turn over to you, Nicola. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
You can.
Thank you very much, Thalia, and thank you, Abel, for the introduction and for working with me to put this webinar together. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody who's listening in. It's great that you can join us. And just to introduce myself, as Thalia has already mentioned, I'm the challenge leader for the food systems portfolio for the Global Challenges Research Fund, the GCRF as we call it, which is a program of funding that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, that's run under the umbrella of the UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. So within the GCRF program, we have funded probably in excess of 1,000 projects now. It's been running for about 4 years. And those 1,000 projects have been separated out into 6 different portfolios. And I oversee the food systems portfolio, which includes everything to do with food production, nutrition, manufacturing, everything related to food and food systems. And within that portfolio, there are probably around 300 different projects, which there is clearly some overlaps with the other portfolios as well, particularly the health portfolio. But it's a way of portioning up all the projects that have been funded. And for us as challenge leaders, our role is to look for synergy across the projects to help to deliver impact from those projects, and to also set the strategic direction going forwards. So one of the most important pillars of the GCRF program is equitable partnerships. And one of my colleagues within the international development team at UKRI, called Sarah Ball, has done a lot of work in this area, and has consulted with stakeholders to come up with guidelines for how we as funders can best facilitate equitable partnerships as new research proposals are put together. And I'm sure I'll be referring to her work as we go through this webinar. So half of my time is dedicated to the GCRF role. The other half of my time, as Thalia mentioned, I'm Professor of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Central Lancashire. And my area of specialty is micronutrients, particularly looking at solutions to zinc deficiency globally. For the last 15 years, I've been working very closely with partners in northwest Pakistan, in some very low resource communities in the brick kilns around Peshawar, where zinc deficiency in particular is prevalent. And we've been looking for low-cost, sustainable solutions to zinc deficiency. And at the moment, we're looking at biofortification of wheat as a strategy. So that's just a little bit about my background on what I do. And Thalia asked me to say, what do I think about when people say equitable research partnerships? And I think the best way to illustrate this is using a picture. And we weren't going to be using the screen share, so I've printed it and I'll show it to you. And it may be a picture that you've seen before. I hope you can get that. I hope it's clear on your screens. But for me, this really illustrates what equitable partnerships really mean. Sometimes we confuse equality and equity. Equality is all about a level playing field, making sure that everybody's stood up at the same level. But equity is different. Equity is more than that. It's making sure that everybody had an equal opportunity to participate or to contribute, or in this example, to watch the ball game. So that picture for me really helps me to grasp the difference between the two things and understand that it's not just about making sure that everybody's treated equally, although that's important, but also compensating where that equality, because we're never going to achieve complete equality across the board, where that equality is lacking, to compensate for that. And that for me is what I think about when I think about equity. Thalia also asked us to say a few words about what we've grappled with most deeply when we try and tackle equity. And I think for me, and tapping into my research experience and working with colleagues in Pakistan, I think for me, the thing I've really struggled with is the inherent inequalities associated with funding. Being the PI on a project, being the budget holder, that sets up, right from the very start of a project, that sets up an inequality that we need to be able to compensate for to get that equity in our partnerships. Every time I think we're doing it right, we've been doing it for 15 years and we've got better over the years, and every time I think, yeah, but we've got there, we're doing this right, but we're really ticking the boxes for equity, something comes along, something shines a light on our practice. I read something, I write something, and then read it back to myself, and I realize that really we're not there yet. And it's been an iterative process and a learning process and an ongoing process. So that's what I've struggled with most deeply over the last 15 years. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand back to Thalia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And I will turn straight over to Bhavani.
Thank you, Thalia, and hello, everybody. Pleasure to be on this all-woman panel, as Thalia said. Well, I am from the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. We are a not-for-profit for sustainable rural development headquartered in Chennai, India. And my background is in economics, and at the foundation, we are a multidisciplinary team and working in different thematic areas like biotechnology, biodiversity conservation, eco-technology, food and nutrition security research, and using ICTs for rural development. So the focus is on sustainable rural development. We engage in policy research and action research, working with communities, and in policy advocacy in terms of replicating for upscaling the models that work on the ground for how to have their uptake at a larger level, so with policymakers at different levels of stakeholders. And over the last 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, I was project manager of this research program consortium that Thalia referred to, leveraging agriculture for nutrition in South Asia, which is UK aid funded. And we had 3 partners from the South, and the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, we were the lead institution. We had partners in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and there were 3 international partners in that. And so that was, again, a very learning experience in terms of the issue that we are going to be discussing today. So when one talks about equity in research partnership, I see it at 2 levels in the context of the work that we engage in. One is in our, when we do engage in action research, working with the rural communities, which is in terms of taking them as partners in the research and not just as beneficiaries, or which is often what the term that is used in development, the development circles as such. So in terms of respecting their indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, or the capabilities that they come with, because ultimately whatever we are trying out, they need to own, and they will be the spokespersons who take it forward and can make it sustainable. So that's one issue where equity comes in. And the other is in terms of research partnerships that we engage in with institutions, both at the national level and international, like the LAMSA consortium, and how the lines of engagement develop between the collaboration develop between the partners. And in both of these, I think the most important is the issue of transparency and trust in terms of the engagement, and in terms of, so communication is most important, so that one gets the fullest confidence of the other partner, and one is able to carry forward. So the ownership of the agenda that we are, research agenda, and taking it forward. So for both of which, I think transparency and trust are very, very important. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bhavani. And I'll turn to Valarie now, last but not least. And you are muted, just a reminder.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for being part of this. And Thalia and Abel, thank you for coordinating this, and other panelists. It's really great to be invited. I am an intervention scientist. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation, so I'm an Indigenous researcher. And the area of my work is focused primarily on changing food environments and improving food systems to then affect health outcomes in Indigenous communities. And I've done this work for about almost 20 years. I started very traditionally in terms of how I was trained. I've done, a cardiovascular disease prevention fellowship, and some of my earliest work was focused really on disease management. And I've sort of made my way backwards to prevention, and most recently working within the food systems. I've always used a participatory research orientation, but more recently I've been able to look at health through a more holistic lens and to look at health from an Indigenous sort of perspective, where everything within the community and the environment is highly connected. And that's been part of the intervention science work that I do. When I think about equitable partnerships, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that everyone sort of has something to gain and something to lose, and that people are willing to come together and be honest and be vulnerable. I find that when that is the nature of the relationships with my partners, that they're actually much more effective and much more authentic and equitable. The thing that I probably grapple with the most is similar to what other panelists have said, which is really the privileging of Western, white sort of ways of knowing, and the fact that most of the funders are really just more comfortable giving funding to organized organizations that they know that are typically led by white leaders. And I think that when you walk into a community and you want to engage in an equitable partnership, but you're the one that's bringing in the money, I think it's really, really hard to start out in that way. The cards are stacked against that. So that would be the biggest challenge.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate all of you coming today to offer your thoughts. And I think we're going to start a bit of, I have a few questions that I'd like to start with our speakers, and we can discuss in a group. I think that a lot of us sort of agree on, and many people in this community have similar perspectives and thoughts, and but really putting these ideas into practice is so challenging. And it can, you can start out with all the best metrics and intentions, and sometimes it's, as Nicola said, you have to kind of revisit. It's a constant process. So we're especially interested to hear in practice how all three of you have addressed these issues in your work. So I'm going to start off with my first question really is, what are the metrics or the considerations that are most common when creating, describing or measuring partnerships? And I know that you all have actually several different roles that you play. So if you, when you answer, maybe you can just say, like, from the perspective of a funder or the perspective of a participant or the perspective of a researcher, how those might be different. But really, I want to ask you about this the considerations that are most important when you set out on your work. And maybe we can start with Valarie, or we'll go backwards, and then please feel free to jump in.
Well, in my work as a researcher, so keeping in mind that the core of our work is to conduct scientific research, most of which, virtually all of our funding comes from the National Institutes of Health. So the focus is partnering with communities that actually have a research question of interest that they want to answer, and they have a hypothesis that they want to test. And so keeping that as a focus, we balance that with action for social change. And so that's really the delicate dance of how we do our work. And so we're trying to affect objective health outcomes, because those are the things that our funders want to see. So we're looking at, does a food system intervention improve blood pressure? Does it change access to healthy foods? Does it increase vegetable and fruit intake? Does it reduce hemoglobin A1C? Those are the things that in the end have to be part of the story. Sadly, what often matters equally to communities and to a partnership is the process of engaging in that research. And that process is very minimally examined. So it's often not considered an important metric or outcome to assess. You would have those objective clinical measures as your priority metrics that funders would look at, followed by probably health behaviors. It's more, I think, in vogue now, so to speak, to look at policy outcomes. So if you had some policy outcomes of the research, that would be an important metric. But as far as, do the partners, did they have an empowering experience? Was the goal that they aspire to achieve, did they get closer to that? Those kinds of things tend to not be evaluated or focused upon. And I would say also, one of the things that I had the experience of was partnering with a community that was very, very interested in being part of the publication and writing aspect of the research, which is typically where I've found most communities are kind of less engaged. This particular community, because of their history of erasure and their prioritization of documentation and story and narrative as being something that they had never really in the last, several hundred years had the, ability to tell their own story. It had been told for them by colonization. This community was very interested in publishing. And so we wrote the manuscript together, and it really emphasized to me, that was a great experience for me, because it emphasized to me how important it is for a community to be highly engaged in that, explaining the story and the narrative to those who are funding, to the audience who is reading about the work. That's a really critical time to be highly involved. This community wanted to use this experience as a way to document part of their history so that future generations would see that they were organizing and that they were continuing the work. And so that was a really powerful way for them to take back control of the metrics that they valued, how to share those metrics, and how to tell the story in their own words. So I would say that part of it is a way to really change the narrative and engage in how you want to retell the story of metrics and what's important.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to give Bhavani and Nicola a chance to respond. And then I think there are many sort of parts of what you said that I hope we'll also come back to.
I think Valerie's put it beautifully in terms of the different aspects, and like Nicola said right in the beginning, this is an evolving space in terms of how what the metrics as well are also. And when it is a funded program, one largely finds that the demands of the funders dictate the metrics in terms of the deliverables, and so you are largely governed by that. So in terms of like high quality publication in peer-reviewed journals and how many can come out. So that's one important output. And then in terms of impact on policy, what is there? So it's always like what is the kind of impact, what can you quantify, and so those become key project deliverables. And in the process, oftentimes, like Valarie said, the process kind of does not get the kind of importance or weightage that is required. And when you're working especially with if it is just secondary database research, that's something you can do, churn out a paper and get a publication. But when you're working with communities, it is such a nuanced process, and you need to take into account so many aspects, and that I think is something which still needs to be recognized and find that space in partnerships, not always an easy process. For instance, at the foundation, we've been engaged in promoting in a participatory action research initiative called Community Hunger Fighters, where we work to build the community capacity in understanding the agriculture nutrition linkages and how to improve their own situation based on the available resources with them. So it's a process of their understanding and owning it and taking it forward. So you can't really have determined outputs as to we will have so many numbers of trained community hunger fighters. For the purpose of reporting, we may do it, but actually how much of it will sustain and actually go forward, that's something which one needs to recognize, that it is a process that happens. And so that's, I think, one of the challenges in terms of the metrics of measurement. And so these are the two issues which I think need to be kept in consideration as one is the funding agencies that fund research projects, and as well, and when we work with rural communities, as again taking them as partners, the metrics in terms of their capacity building and the whole of how we approach it, because we also come with our own biases influenced by so many factors. I think that's also an important factor to consider.
I can speak perhaps from a funder's perspective. And as I said before, for GCRF, Equitable Partnership is one of the central pillars. So that is something we look and examine very closely when we receive grant applications to see how that's been achieved. So some of the things we look at in the evaluation process is to see whether there's evidence of co-creation of the research question, to see whether partners from the Global North and the Global South have all been involved, and then there's evidence for that they have all been involved in setting that research question, that research question is relevant to the community or the beneficiaries or the partners that are engaged in that research process, that there has been consultation with in-country stakeholders and policymakers to make sure that the questions that we as academics want to answer are actually relevant questions to the policymakers. We may have some fantastic research question that we want to answer, but actually if the policymakers don't really need an answer to that question, then we have to question, is it worth investing in? Because the research at the end of the day needs to deliver impact, and that impact is best achieved through change in policy in a lot of cases. So we look for that. We look for how the grant has been structured in terms of the distribution of the funds to ensure that there's no rule for this, but we like to see that a large portion, if not the majority of the funds, are utilised in the Global South context. And we also look for organisational structures in place that provide that equal representation of co-investigators from the Global South alongside those from the Global North, and ensure that the way the project is governed and organised reflects that equity. And then the last thing on my list, I think Valarie touched on a little bit as well when she was speaking, really importantly, is around publication. And this is a really sensitive and thorny issue for many of us engaged in research, not only who to include as authors, but also the order of the authors. And that's a really difficult thing to resolve, because it is complex and requires, as Bhavani was saying, a high degree of trust between the partners to work that out and to figure out how you're going to organise the publications, who's going to be first author, who should even be included. And as certainly in the Global North, there's immense pressure on academics and universities to be the first author or to be the PI, and how you balance that against ensuring that everybody has a role to play and everybody has an opportunity to take on that leadership role in the authorship. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Maybe Nicola, you could speak a little bit about the process. I know that this is upcoming, but Nicola has a piece coming out soon, and you described in that piece how you landed on an author, on decisions around authorship. Maybe you could just briefly mention an example of how you did that.
Yes, I mean there are various ways of doing this. There's some guidance documents that you can refer to that. In fact, many journals subscribe to a guidance. Sorry, I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head, but many journals subscribe to a guidance document that states who should be included in the authorship list to start with, and that sets out that all authors have got to be involved at some stage of the research process, whether it be in the data collection, the data interpretation, the design of the research, and the writing of the manuscripts. There are 4 criteria that the authors all need to be able to tick the box. Mm-hmm. So that's one part of the conundrum. The other part of the conundrum is the order of authors, and this is a really interesting one, because different things mean different orders mean different things in different subject disciplines, but also in different countries. In my subject discipline, growing up in academia, in the sort of medical research area, it was always the first author and the last author that were the most important. Generally, the first author was the one who was the student, the PhD student, the person who'd done the legwork and who'd perhaps written the first draft. The last author tended to be the leader, the head of the group, the PI, or the prof of the department back in the day, and then the ones in the middle didn't seem to matter. In other subject disciplines, it might be that the first, it goes down in order of importance, first, second, third, fourth, etc., with the last one being the least important. But in my work in Pakistan, I had a bit of a surprise recently, because I was working to the sort of rubric the first and last, which is how I understood sort of in the medical field. One of my collaborators is a medic, and oftentimes I was putting him in that last position, thinking that I was honouring him by doing that as sort of the anchor man on the Pakistan side. But it came out in conversations actually from his cultural perspective, actually that was the worst place to be, and I was actually insulting him. So yeah, so those kinds of conversations need to take place really early on. And we've now, for our research team, have a guidance document that we've developed that sets out how we're going to organize things. And actually there is no one size fits all, and it does depend if you're working in an interdisciplinary project with authors from the medical field or from the geography field or from, you know, climate change field. The only way to resolve this is by being really clear when you publish the paper in the acknowledgement section at the end. If you say what protocol you've used for deciding the authorship, is it first and last? Is it a ranking order, or is it alphabetical? You know, and just be really transparent as to how you've come up with that decision. And I think that's the way we've agreed to publish from our project.
That's wonderful. Valarie, how did you decide when you were working with a community that was so interested in that documentation and being part of that process?
I think that it's always a very interesting conversation in that community and in every community that with which I've partnered, talking about these issues at the very beginning about, you know, this is who I am coming into this work, and this is the orientation from which I'm coming to this work. I'm doing it because I actually really, really believe in the same goals that you have for your community, and I'm interested and willing to stand side by side with you to achieve this, and I'm here to commit to doing that. So having that clearly understood from the beginning, and part of that conversation is, this is how the study design is going to look. This is what we want as a group in terms of the study design. And at the end, there's going to be some writing up of this story and the process. And that's going to be expected from the funders. They're going to want to see and hear what we did. And that's going to take several forms. What forms do you care about the most from a community perspective? What forms of publication are less valuable to you? And recognizing that those may take different shapes depending on the different audiences. The funders may care about these things, and those are the things that we have to talk about and highlight to them. We may care about other things, and those are the things that we want to share with the communities. How do you want to be involved? Is there value to you as a community in sharing the story? And so I find that when we're having the conversation really broadly and very much at the beginning, that we anticipate all along in the journey, this is going to go in our paper, or this is going to go in our newsletter, or this is going to go on the website. And I think that, you know, we also use film in our work. We use video narrative, participatory video. And so people can tell their experiences, and we put those video narratives on our website, and we make film. And that's an important way to also share story, which is how people in a lot of communities really communicate their lived experience of it. So making sure not to make it all about just one form of sharing what we did and how we did it. But there are many forms of it. There's a lot of celebrating and lifting up of people who are engaging in the work. And when those aspects of the story take the same kinds of priority and are privileged, then it's a lot easier not to feel like this is the be-all end-all in this particular publication. And this is, you know, you as the outsider getting to, you know, wrap this up and tell it as you wish. when we do have, and we try to really encourage that particular form of publication, scientific writing, we talk about, we actually come and we say, this is what the American Journal of Public Health guidelines are. And this is what they mean. And this is the journal that we want to publish in. How do people feel about that? Here are example articles. Here's a copy of it. Here's another journal of what we're interested in. What do you think? And so when we talk about the journals, and then we talk about who wants to be part of this, and what does that entail? And with the Native communities that I work with, they may or may not have institutional review boards. Very few actually do. As sovereign nations, they don't engage in enough research to have that. But they usually have an organized committee that is tasked with that responsibility of reviewing the research products, including publications. And that's part of the capacity to engage in research, because if the community doesn't have that, then it has to be discussed early on. Because there will be a need, if funding has been provided, to share the results. It's part of it.
That's really, really, really interesting. And I think that this, you guys are tying a lot of these sort of metrics and outputs and outcomes and the way that we think about them as the sort of culmination of a very long process. So I wonder if I can ask really specifically, especially almost on the front end or as in throughout the building of these partnerships, how you've sort of, what you've considered to be the most important aspects of that enabling environment before you get to that stage, and maybe some things that have hindered you also in your experience. Maybe we can start with Bhavani.
Yeah.
Putting you on the spot.
Before I get into your question, I think the point that Valarie made about the multiple kinds of research outputs and products, that's very important. And I think funders are also beginning to realize or see the value in that. And that's something we did quite a lot of in terms of under LANSA, in terms of tailoring the products according to the audience that you're addressing. So it can be audio, visual outputs, and as well, high quality publications, etc. But coming to the question of enabling environment, I think start with right from the proposal stage, there needs to be the issue of ownership of the research agenda and the way the finances or the budgeting is done. So it goes back to having that trust and transparency in communication that I mentioned right at the beginning. And oftentimes, of course, one may end up doing, things may get done in a rush and the proposal is submitted, but there needs to be room subsequently for negotiation and having this kind of openness, because the ultimate objective is the relevance of the research to the social context or the that you are addressing. And that was a very positive experience that we had under LANSA, because our UK aid was also a very supporting factor in pushing us to that in terms of having flexibility and budget, in terms of discussing research proposals. It's not like every institution, every partner could decide and come up and say, this is what we want to do, and this is our set budget. So we used to have this detailed process of having a review of research studies and then agreeing on necessity for it and how you take it forward and how much budget could be allocated for it, to try and ensure that all the research priorities are met. And I think in this process, the leadership becomes very important. So especially if you are a multi-institutional consortium, the quality of leadership becomes very important in terms of acceptability across the consortium. And in that, LANSA was very, very fortunate in having a person like Dr. Prakash Shetty, who came with vast experience from the South and had worked a number of years for a number of years in the north as well. And along with that leadership, also what what happened under LANSA was initially we had the research leads who were also the partner institution leads, but then that was leading to a kind of conflict of interest, like every researcher wanting to protect his or her research. So there was a change which was brought in terms of bringing a management lead from the partner institution as a member, forming a consortium steering group. And so this was, would be a person who would take into account the larger perspective and in terms of the global issues and what need to be addressed. And I think that really helped LANSA on its way forward. So a lot of mid-course corrections, there should be room for taking into account as a project or a consortium program progresses, especially when it's something as long as for a period of 6 years, to have that room for that. And again, in terms of an enabling environment, if you're specifically looking at North-South, in terms of having that, recognizing the capacities that are available in the South and also encouraging it. So oftentimes earlier, there have been instances where there have been universities who've come and worked with us, and all that many organizations end up getting used just as data collectors, and all the data is taken up for writing of papers by others. So those are just not, and it's just not on, and you need to have this kind of balanced perspective, which again under LANSA, it worked very well in terms of, one was at the research level, and then in terms of research outputs also, there would be an internal review process and how we went forward in terms of taking it forward. So I think the research relevance and the ownership across the board is very important for partnerships to work.
Absolutely, that's a really important point.
I think from a funder's perspective, in terms of creating an enabling environment for participating in equitable partnerships, one thing that we struggle with as funders is that we do recognise that in order to put together a proposal that takes into consideration the views of the different partners and also potentially the community and the policymakers, that takes time. And often we don't have time to give to our academics to have that time to create those equitable partnerships. And that's something that we're very much aware of. We are constrained in terms of from when the call comes out to receiving the proposal. That time span we always give as much as we can, but we are tied ourselves by budget cycles, and so we can never give as much time as we would like to give, or as much time as academics would like to have. One way that we've tried to work around this is to have a two-stage application process, with the first stage being an opportunity to apply for funding, to get your partners together, to have those conversations, to do that consultation work, and then go forward to a second stage for a full proposal. So that's one mechanism that we've employed to try and facilitate the generation of equitable partnerships. And another thing that we've tried to do as funders is give opportunity for researchers in the Global South to be principal investigator. That's something that's quite new to UKRI and to the calls, but there's something that is happening more and more now. We had a call out last year, Global Engagement Networks, where the PI actually had to be from the Global South. And so we are moving more towards that. It's not always easy to achieve. The MRC are being good pioneers in this area and putting more and more calls out where PI can come from the Global South, but something that funders are aware of and are trying to address.
That's wonderful. I wanted to, since you've touched on this, the efforts from funders, I wanted to invite Rachel Lambert, who also works with us on IMMANA, to comment on this from a funder's perspective, because I know that DFID, her organization, is also working quite a lot to bring out these. And I wonder, Rachel, if you can speak to the mechanisms that you have engaged with that have helped to do this in your own portfolios. You're on mute, just FYI. Let's maybe Abel check that she's able to unmute. There you go. We can't hear you though, if you're speaking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks. Sorry for that. And thanks for inviting me to speak. I think so. I think the first point to make is that is for us to be fairly honest and upfront about the fact that many of our research partnerships aren't equitable, and there's some really significant structural constraints to that, both in the UK and internationally. My colleague Martin Broadley found me today some of the World Bank figures on some of these constraints at a global level. And the World Bank has looked at number of researchers per million population. And you've got a situation where in the UK we've got 4,340 PhD level upwards researchers per million people. Compare that with 253 per million in India. But when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, you have Mozambique 43, Rwanda 12 researchers per million, Tanzania 19. So that's got huge implications for our expectations about how we go about forming partnerships, because the workloads and the pressures on those researchers in the South, in terms of being pulled into policy committees at a national level, or ethics committees, or administration and teaching within their own context, makes it really difficult for them to compete on the same level with northern researchers in terms of writing papers, accessing grants, etc. And when you look at the UK as well, there's real issues around race and gender, and it's quite difficult to kind of pin down some of the figures on that. But I think the 2018-19 figures for the UK showed that 76% of UK academic staff were white, 9% were Asian, and 2% were black. The rest are either mixed or we don't have data on, so there's quite a big data gap there as well. But there are huge disparities, and so we're dealing with a really skewed system both in the UK and globally. I wanted to highlight an issue that I think is it can give us a kind of entry point to some of these issues on partnerships, and it's around kind of ethics and ethics issues. And I think the challenge for agriculture specifically is that much research is typically considered low risk in terms of ethics, and sits outside of ethical review processes. And so we see a number of agriculture research initiatives which may have surveys or on-farm studies that can be quite quickly dominated by external partner agendas without really looking at what the consent process looks like from different perspectives, whether it's house or farm, village, traditional authorities or so on. So I think there's a particular challenge in agriculture-related research that looking at those ethics issues is not part and parcel of what we were doing. And if we were doing that in a more systematic fashion and addressing those issues, looking at local academic representation and going through local ethics committees, I think some of those issues around capacity and consent and challenging us to ask whether this research really needs to be done here in this context could all help build and strengthen those local partnerships. and avoid kind of risks of helicopter research, which are kind of particularly enough in medical fields. So I wanted to flag that last year DFID produced new ethics guidance for research monitoring and evaluation, and to help ensure that we're in line with international best practice on that, and that our research partners that we fund are guided by those ethical principles and standards. And it'd be great to share that with this group. We're kind of currently doing a survey to get user feedback on it, whether it's appropriate, whether it's working, and we sort of see that as quite an interactive resource. But I think it's particularly important in this field where ethics issues are being neglected quite a bit, and can really help leverage those better partnerships. And I think it's particularly important at the moment with the COVID pandemic, because we know from previous health emergencies that that they can exacerbate quite quickly vulnerability of partners and beneficiaries of sexual abuse and exploitation. And so again, there's been some very recent guidance from UKCDR and safeguarding guidance in this area, and I think that that's been particularly adapted in response to COVID to try and ensure that that aspect is covered through our programs. And then just can I just cover something on metrics as well? I think Bhavani and Valarie and Nikki have all highlighted really important issues around kind of combining incentives around peer review publications with impact development, impact policy impacts, and looking at kind of authorship. I mean, that's something that I think is really, we're starting to look at much more, kind of tracking authorship of outputs during quality review of programs. And we're seeing some examples of good practice really emerging with some of our partners. Although absolutely we note the points that you make around different disciplines having different practices and the need to kind of bottom out those issues early on in the process as well. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of looking at some of those issues and using the metric data a little bit more effectively. And I think the other one to flag is budget and budget distributions, and making sure those are reviewed upfront in the funding grant making process, and it's often quite problematic that many proposals that we see are very heavily skewed in funding allocations to northern partners with sort of quite tokenistic funding to the southern partners. So I think that's another kind of key area that we need to be looking at as part of developing research proposals and grants and so on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And you made so many really important points. The sound was not perfect, so we will try to summarize also some of what has been said after this webinar using the recording. And I just wanted to highlight that, you know, one of our panelists, one of our participants asked why there's a need for equitable partnerships in agriculture. And I think you very well, I mean, you touched on that very well, and not just why they're needed, but, or maybe not even as much as why they're needed, but the fact that there's much weaker systems for addressing the ethics of those agricultural interventions. So I think we'll move on to a few more questions from our audience. I will mention one thing, which is that I know that UKRI has also published a new document on research partnerships and ethics, and Nicola can speak to that if she'd like. And then we've also, we wanted to highlight the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource Poor Settings, which I think research consortia are also using more and more. And we have compiled, primarily me and Rachel Dixon from IDS have compiled a list of resources which is downloadable as an RAS file, as well as an EndNote file with the attached PDFs if you are able to use EndNote. And we will make that available to participants. We're actually getting a brand new website next week. And so we will put that up on the website in the coming week once we migrate all of our materials over. So stay tuned, but it should be down, we'll put it in the chat box, and it'll be downloadable on the website. So let me go to a question by Jeff, which is, how do you create a place of trust in the space of unequal compensation and unequal roles and unequal experience and unequal personalities? What specifically have you done or seen done, and how have you course corrected when needed? It's a big one.
I'll have a go at that. That is a huge question, and how you build trust with all those inequities going on. But at the end of the day, trust is something that happens between individuals, and that takes time. It's not something that can be done overnight or in a phone call or a single Skype conversation. And I'm thinking about when you're putting grant proposals together and you're wanting to engage with your partners and to co-create research. It's a really difficult thing to do in a short period of time. And I think that's really one of the beauties of the approach of the two-stage funding, where you can have an additional amount of money to travel or to hold workshops with academic partners, with community members, to really identify what the research questions are before you even embark upon a full grant application. So I suppose with my researcher hat on now, that the way we've overcome this is really through long-term relationship with a small NGO working in the region where our research communities are, who have already established a very strong trusting relationship with the community as our research partners, through working with them over a period of time of delivering on promises and commitments that are of benefit and are of interest to the community. And I think that's how we've done it really over time, and one-to-one relationships. Irrespective of all of those other confounding factors that are around, it's about interpersonal relationships at the end of the day. Projects will stand or fall on the strength of those relationships, of those one-to-one relationships.
Absolutely. And I think when I was speaking to you all before, Valarie, you mentioned something quite interesting about when we were coming back to both the trust and the enabling environment. You said that it's much easier to work with communities that have a capacity to self-organize, because as a researcher, if they don't, and there is not a lot of common ground or established structures that have a bit of a groundswell already of movement and trust and capacity for organization, that you end up as a researcher being a community organizer and a researcher, which is very, very hard. So maybe you could speak just a bit more to that.
Sure. I like that question that was asked about the trust. I don't know how you can ever really be certain, how trusted you are within a community. There are certainly communities that I work with where I feel like there's a high degree of trust and a high degree of solidarity, really. It takes a lot of time, like Nicola said. I think it also takes, action on the part of the person who is perhaps not from that community, because trust has to be built within a group as well, a research partnership. So just because you're from the community and you're within that community doesn't mean you automatically are trusted either. But I think, there are some things that I've done in my experience that have been told to me that have created a lot of that trust. You know, if it turns out a funder, for example, is asking for something that the community really doesn't believe in, I've said, let's not take the funding, you know, and I think that's a big demonstration that I believe in and really live the practices of what it is that I'm, you know, of these values. You know, let's not do it. It's not ethical. You know, I think also when I engage with a partner, you know, in academia, we provide references. I provide references, and I also provide community references. I also say these are leaders from this community that I worked with for 10 years, and they can talk with you if you would like to talk with them about the kinds of processes that we engage in as research partners. And, you know, you can hear from them what the research that our group does is like. I think those are ways that you can tell who you are, and show who you are. And then I think that, you know, just over time, being willing to engage in conversations and being willing to be wrong, being willing to learn. And I think someone said, make mid-course changes. I think that that's really, really important, to always be open to not knowing what happens next. You know, you show up with your best idea. You say, this is who I am and what I have to offer. But you're just one person in that part of a larger group. And that's kind of the bulk of it, really. Yeah, I think as far as what makes an environment great to work in is if they're already organized, is there a high level of organization, is there social cohesion? Those are more equitable partnerships because they know who they are and what they want and they want to accomplish. And so you can push to ask hard questions and to be challenging and to you know, you have a lot more freedom with how you can really challenge and push as an individual, as a researcher. Then I think other aspects, you know, it's ideal and fabulous when you're invited to a community, when they want you to be there, they've asked you to come. And I think that you know, those are the things that make it more equitable, make it more engaging. And I've said no to a lot of partnerships that I felt like, yeah, it's not, I am in a place where I have research questions that I personally want to do, and I can't be here in this area long enough to really engage with you in a way that's sort of authentic and, you know, long term. You know, it's not a good fit. And that's important, to be able to do that, even when it's something that you care about and something that you want to do. There's times when it's like this community doesn't have the capacity to do the work that my pressures in my institution require at this point in my career. And being really, really honest about those pressures. That's important.
Just to get a quick word in there, Thalia. I think, yes, as Nicola said, communication is the most important in terms of, you know, because knowing that it's not a level playing field and being aware of the inequities that exist, and having that communication channel open at all times and being accessible, and ranging from one-on-one communication to group meetings to ensure that, you know, the concerns of everyone is being addressed. I think it is a process that has to continue throughout the partnership for it to be successful.
That's very, very interesting. All of you are making such really fantastic points. I hope that there are going to be a lot of unanswered questions. We have about 15 more minutes, and I'm gonna ask another one. But just to let the participants know, we will offer a recording of this webinar, and we also will try to, I hope I can cajole our panelists to provide some further thoughts and maybe some written comments to remaining questions after this webinar. So, but let me move on to a question about funding from Jeff Kira and Anne-Marie Mayer. Given the distance between equitable partnerships or social justice and objective health outcomes, how do you draw the line between those two factors to be attractive to a research funder? To what extent do you think local partners can determine their own metrics given the difficulties with funding? And that is echoed by a few other comments and questions, for instance, from Shweta Manohar about these different sort of levels of equity and so many different voices and needs within these consortia.
That's a difficult question, as you can tell by the silence. Can you try and simplify that question for us?
Sure.
A little bit, Claudia?
I think that there's so I think I would say that the crux of this question really is that there's sort of a social justice and equity and process oriented piece that really does relate to what we all want to truly achieve, which is systemic community embedded change, and the fact that the language that we often speak as researchers is very health outcomes metrics oriented, and there's just such a divide, and everybody knows about it and talks about it, but in terms of sort of practical approaches and solutions, how do you if you want to do a process oriented, very embedded participatory research project, how do you make that attractive and feasible within the funding structures that we currently have, especially given the very cutthroat and competitive environments of academia?
I don't think there is such a gap between social justice and health outcomes. I
agree.
I think you could say it seems like that, but I think that part of the exciting piece of doing this work for me personally is connecting those dots and understanding the parts of ourselves and our communities that have been broken and how to put those pieces together. So I think that indeed your BMI and your diabetes and your blood pressure is indeed completely related to systemic racism, is indeed completely related to colonization, is completely related to removal of your community from the land and the disruption of your food systems. And here's how. And I think that that is exactly the part of this process that excites me, because it is telling the truth where the truth is never told, and it is giving back parts of the context and the story that people don't want to hear about or want to think about or want to see. And I think that many communities totally get that. They totally know that the fact that they don't have any grocery stores in their community is exactly because they're brown or they're black. It's exactly because of those things. And it's not lost on them. The research is actually not really for them. in a lot of ways. The questions aren't really for them in a lot of ways. The funding goes exactly to that. It goes exactly to using data to change the narrative. And that was why the process is so important, because those health outcomes are really just the tip of the iceberg of the larger story. And that's why I do that. Question itself is why this work is exciting to me. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's the whole part of, that's the whole process right there.
If I can come in there, I think, yes, Valarie, what you said is, really makes sense in terms of the researcher needs to be clear of this wider, larger domain and the understanding of the societal nuances and where we are coming from and how our research, the relevance of our research. It's very, there will be many a time when, the funder says this funding call is for so and so, and if you are in need of funds and you just try to turn out a proposal to address something, then you won't really be taking into account all these different aspects of equity and issues like that. But in the longer term, I think the researcher's perspective and understanding and the ethical stand as to, this is what I will do, this is where I am willing to go. I think that's very, very important in ensuring that there is this equity. And if you are on solid ground, I think one should be able to find the right kind of support or funding for research, because again, that's something which is going to help change the narrative. So it is, in many ways, yes, we also have to be prepared for struggle to engage in it, over a period of time till we get there.
And I just want to say one other thing about the point of, research. Why do you need equitable partnerships in agriculture? I think too, I do a lot of work with Indigenous communities in Hawaii, with Native Hawaiians. And if you look at their agricultural systems, they have these closed systems that sustain their livelihood on these tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for hundreds of years. And, that work is not even considered in food system research. That island itself is 97% of their food is imported. So Indigenous communities have an incredible amount of knowledge to share with the rest of the planet. And I think that to call these communities resource or research poor environments, the entire history of Indigenous peoples is based on trial and error, over all of these hundreds and hundreds of years of finding the best way to do things. So embedded in Indigenous cultures is research. And so it's some, and sustainability. So, I think we need to really look at how we're labeling communities and lay knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing, because indeed it's not research or resource poor in those ways.
You raised some really, really important points there, Valarie, and one thing that we'd really encourage as funders is to go to communities to find solutions to the challenges, because oftentimes, as you say, they will have the best solutions because they'll have that trial and error experience and know what works and what doesn't in their particular context. So engaging with the beneficiaries as partners in the research is a really important part of the process of framing those research questions.
Absolutely. I know that there's been a long process of that. So maybe I'm going to move to one question about how, in an ideal world, we'll have these long developing relationships that ingrain trust and sharing and sort of locally sourced solutions. But we do have one question from Phil, our colleague Phil James here in the UK. And he says, you know, in the UK, we're under a tremendous amount of pressure to produce outputs that qualify for the REF framework, where a lot of weight is placed on first and corresponding author. And equity of partnerships seems not to be formally assessed, especially if you're the person who cultivates that and gives that power over. So how could we sort of lobby institutions, or how, at least at UKRI, are you engaging with that, given the constraints for researchers in that environment?
I feel your pain. Yeah, it's something that is very apparent with the REF cycle, the point it is, and those REF outputs needing to be demonstrated. But I do think the REF process is changing and has changed over the last 2 cycles. I think it is much more impact focused now than it used to be. And of course, in order for research to be impactful, it has to address all those points in equitable partnerships that we've already discussed. So, you know, finding solutions that work locally, defining problems and challenges that are felt locally in the partner countries. So I think by shifting the emphasis more towards the impact of the research, you are naturally shifting the centre of gravity towards a more equitable partnership.
These are the kinds of webinars this is the exact kind of thing that's changing things. In my view, it's part of this, having webinars like this, asking these kinds of questions, raising it in the institutions and in the communities and with the funders, putting it at the forefront is part of changing it.
Absolutely. I think it's very, very clear to me, at least, and we have such a privilege of having Nicola as a member of the GCRF group here with us, and Rachel from the DFID side of things. It's quite lovely to at least be really engaging in this type of fora. I wanted to go to one question. I think we do have quite a few people still on, so if you don't mind, we might run a few minutes over, and even if you have to drop off, we'll provide the recording. But there's an interesting question from Kenda Cunningham, who says, if you're surveying across thousands of communities, how do you genuinely engage, especially beyond a community-based organizational leader? And what does that really mean when you start to push towards scale, which is so much about what funders seem to want these days, is this change at scale. So how do you all engage with that? Maybe you don't. I mean, maybe there's we're talking about a scale that, Valarie, you work very specifically with specific communities, with specific organizations, but I'm sure, Nicola, you might have seen these much more broad, nationally based partnerships that are supposed to still embrace principles of equity. And how is that different?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's about the principles, and I think this is, I happen to have this document on my desk because I refer to it regularly. It's one that you've already referred to. It's the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource Poor Settings, and it's a really handy document. It has four key principles: respect, care, honesty, and fairness. And I think, when you're talking about scaling up research, from those sort of small individual projects where you are close to the community, you're close to the partnership, something much larger on a national level, then I think the research is built on those principles, and if you can embed those pillars, those principles into the research program from the start, then it should be scalable. That would be my view on that. There is another document that Thalia mentioned earlier on as well, that's been produced by UKRI and is available on their website, called Promoting Fair and Equitable Research Partnerships to Respond to Global Challenges. And again, that gives some really nice guidance on how to form those equitable partnerships from the beginning, and how they can be scaled.
Just to comment quickly on that, I would like to share our experience. So in terms of, I think time is a crucial issue. So within the period of project cycle, you may not really be able to reach the kind of scale demanded, or like when you're starting out as a research study to demonstrate something. Or so like here at the foundation, we kind of pilot models where you demonstrate the results, and then you engage in advocacy for replication and uptake, which happens at different levels. So for instance, under LAMSA, we worked on to demonstrate feasibility of a farming systems approach to address the problem of malnutrition. And towards the end of the program, we were able to engage with other CBOs, with research institutes, and with policymakers about the need for nutrition sensitive agriculture. And 2 years after the program has ended, we are still continuing to do that. We are working with agriculture universities in India to promote this, the farming system for nutrition approach across. So it's kind of, that's something maybe across the board funders also need to look at, how to keep track of what happens once the program has ended. I think that would be a useful input to have in terms of how it's going forward, because within that period of 4 or 5 years, you may not really be able to show how it scales up. But if the organization is able to take it forward, continue to work on it, which like at the foundation now, leveraging agriculture for nutrition is one of our core areas, and we are really driving it and building on the work that we did under LAMSA.
I would just add that I think it's really important to have more of a participatory science behind implementation science. I think implementation science has not embedded within its models enough of the participatory research orientation. And I think that does a real disservice to communities where you have small communities, small data, because you're always expected to be starting over at in every research project, and being at the place of efficacy is the intervention efficacious, and we can't afford to do that. We don't have the time. We need to take evidence-based, quote unquote, interventions that have been shown to be efficacious in other communities, and we need to have a high level of adaptability and tailoring to those communities, because if we're always at the place of determining whether something's efficacious, we're going to keep these smaller communities behind in their science. And they don't want to be behind. They deserve rigorous scientific advancements like everyone else. I mean, that's the whole point of why implementation science was invented in the first place, is that gap in getting it to the communities where it's needed the most. And so equity is probably most important in that question of scaling up. And, there are very few interventions that I can think of in Indigenous communities that have been scaled up and replicated in other Indigenous communities. Because of that, because of the belief that we have to make it very culturally tailored to this particular community, I've used evidence-based interventions that are perfectly great for one Indigenous community, as long as there's a high level of adaptation in the implementation process, not so much necessarily in the theoretical underpinnings, but in the implementation process, adapted to that unique context. So there needs to be a lot more work in that area.
It's such a good point. Having bridging some of these themes in my own research, there's really almost that we still are working towards aligning a lot of these ideas of process and what you track for process and what you're really measuring. Are you measuring a process of adaptation and application and change? Are you trying to make an intervention fit without that due process? And what are you really, are you measuring a theoretical idea? Are you measuring the implementation of it? So all of these are extremely important points. So we have, I think we've certainly exhausted our scheduled time, and there are a few more questions on language and funding and the importance of social science. So we'll try to address those in some way. And I think we'll close there. But I honestly do hope that this is the beginning of a longer, deeper conversation. And I'm so grateful to all of you, to Nicola, to Valarie, to Bhavani, and UKRI, and our team, wonderful support team at the ANH Academy and Amana, who have supported this webinar. So I hope that we are all feeling fired up and ready to think and act as we go forward, especially in this time where equity and justice and health is so front and center on all of our minds. So with that, we will provide lots of resources on our website, and we can certainly be in touch with any remaining questions. So Abel, do you want to say any final words, a reminder about the ANH Academy Week? I'm putting him on the spot.
Yeah, sure, no, that's fine. Yeah, thanks everyone for staying for long. And obviously we've passed the time, but it was great to have a lot of people staying, but also actively engaging on the chat and the Q&A box. So yeah, just to say a few words about the ANH Academy Week. It's in 2 weeks' time. So we hope to see you all during the Academy Week. Please register on our website. And if you have any questions on that one, please get in touch on our email, and we'll be happy to sort out any questions that you have.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Thalia.
Thank you.